Welcome to the PERSUIT Podcast, where we talk about all the innovation happening across the legal tech landscape. My name is Chris Albrecht. I am with PERSUIT, and I am your host. And today we're going to be talking about accruals, which is a cruel, dad joke there, topic for many in-house counsel and law firms. And I couldn't think of a better person to bring on to talk about it than my colleague, Chris Perry. He's the VP of Sales at Apperio, which was acquired by PERSUIT earlier this year. So first, let's just welcome you to the show, Chris. Hi, Chris. How you doing?
Great to be here, Chris. Yeah, very excited. Accruals is a bit of a niche and specialist topic within the legal ops world, but one that is really very interesting to get stuck into. Looking forward to it.
You know, it is a niche topic, but it seems to have sort of like an outsized impact. So let's talk real quick, just sort of level set for us. What are accruals and why has this become such an important issue?
Great question. So accruals are a very normal part of a business's financial reporting processes, but they specifically cause a problem when it comes to legal spend. So most categories of spend, if you're buying software, for example, if you're buying office furniture, they're fairly straightforward in terms of how you go about purchasing the spend. You know what you're going to be getting, you know what you're going to be paying for in advance. A lot of legal spend is a little bit more nuanced than that, as we all are very well aware. And that can create some really interesting challenges when it comes to how companies report and track what they're spending throughout the year on those services. And really typically for legal ops, this manifests as a challenge with their how they interact with their finance teams and how they report on this accruals data. Finance need to get a really robust process for how they track and report those costs. And actually, the bigger the company, the more challenging that process can be. And they typically rely on legal ops to be able to drive and deliver that process. And sometimes those processes don't take account of the nuance that exists with law firms and how legal spend is actually tracked day by day.
Yeah, I can imagine that the bigger the company, the more outside firms you're engaging. You know, there's just that lag between work done and billing. And so you've got all this time and then you're trying to keep track of it. So I can imagine that it does become sort of difficult to manage. So when you think about it, so is this an issue who's this sort of like a bigger issue for? Is it a bigger issue for clients who are trying to pay their bills and keep their budgets all in alignment and understand how much they're spending? Or is it a bigger problem? I don't want to use the word problem, right? It sort of exists. Is it a bigger issue for firms which are trying to collect that money?
Yeah, I mean, it presents challenges for both, right? In-house teams have to be able to report on that data, and typically they're being asked by finance to report on that either at a really high level or often, at a more granular matter-by-matter level. And this is quite a tricky process to manage because you're exactly right. There's big chunks of that spend that haven't yet been invoiced, and you need to work out how do we account from that? How do we get that information from our law firms? And typically what ends up happening is clients have to request that information manually from law firms. They have to try and request it's entered in any billing system, or they have to have some kind of regular cadence where they run an accrual process and then they can deliver that reporting to finance. But the way that works presents challenges for the law firms, and then in turn, that obviously creates difficulties back on the client side. So the law firm challenge is typically this process has to happen before the end of the month. So clients have to pick a date, sometimes like the 15th of the month or maybe the 20th of the month, and they have to ask law firms, what are you going to spend on this matter in this month? And that's inherently a bit of a difficult question for law firms because they have to be forward-looking, right? They can't just look in their system at what they spent to date. They have to think, okay, well, what are we going to spend between now and the end of that month? And they have to give a figure for the client. And this is where I think the problem emerges for law firms. They have to think really carefully about, how can they even get that information? They're working across different offices. They might be, engaging different teams for that client. They have to find a way of consolidating that information from their own internal systems. But then additionally, they have to think about, well, what's the number that we give the client? We want to get as accurate as possible. We don't want to under accrue because then the client might object when we invoice them and the amount's higher than we've told them. We don't want to be too far over the accrual because then the client might have a challenge on their reporting. So they have to basically guess. And that can be a really difficult thing from the law firms. And you see this, in a couple of different ways. So one is law firms are notoriously a little bit slow at providing this information. A lot of clients struggle with actually getting that answer out from the law firms on time for them to be able to deliver to finance. And a lot of the time they're kind of having to chase law firms. And obviously from the law firm point of view, that's a lot of extra admin and reporting that they're having to do that they're not necessarily geared up for.
Got it. So let's talk a little bit about what how have people tried to fix this problem? Because this isn't new, right? This is something that's been around for, a long time. And so how have people tried to sort of fix this problem, and why hasn't that worked so far?
Yeah, I think probably in my career, I've seen the whole gamut of clients trying to solve this, in a spreadsheet. And I've seen some really amazing efforts made by legal operations teams there to kind of operationalize how they do accruals reporting, and then interface with finance. Sometimes they're using systems, right? A lot of e-billing systems have functionality where you can request accruals from law firms. You can prompt your law firms with emails or set reminders or deadlines on a pretty automated basis in an e-billing platform. The problem always, though, is that you're relying on your law firms to, one, provide that data in time for you to be able to deliver what finance require, and two, you're relying on their accuracy, and you're asking them to estimate or produce a forward-looking estimate, and that's inherently quite difficult for firms to do. It's very, very hard to be accurate when it comes to legal spend on an hourly basis, because you don't know what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks. It could be a lot higher than you think it is, right, if something changes on a matter. And this leads to a really interesting phenomenon, Chris, which is that law firms have to slightly cushion their accruals estimates. Because if they under-accrue, they're at risk then of upsetting the client when it comes to the point of invoice. And what we've seen in the data over and over again is that accruals tend to be a little bit overestimated, right? There tends to be a little bit of an inflationary edge in accruals. And while that might be really intuitive to people who work with law firms and in legal operations, finance teams, that can present some challenges for how they actually run their part of the process. And I think we've seen a phenomenon with how clients try and tackle this with their finance teams, where legal ops are seen as being a little bit less robust in their reporting than other categories. And I don't really think, it's not particularly fair to legal operations teams, because legal spend is a very different beast to most of the categories of spend that businesses have to deal with today. So I think some of the best processes we've seen are really sophisticated, and you're in a good cadence with your law firms. There's clear expectation setting. There's clear dates established for how this process works. But even in the best processes there's typically quite a lot of manual effort required to sort of prompt to get this information out of law firms. And if it isn't on the client side, it certainly is on the law firm side, where they're having to run an internal reporting process that while they get asked for it a lot, it can be a bit complex, right? Because it requires gathering information from different systems, and then it requires someone to go in and think about what work are we doing for this client, where do we think it's going to be at the end of this month. And again, the bigger the work you're doing with your law firm, the bigger the scale of the matter, the bigger that problem can be.
So it seems like it's just something just more fundamental, right? Like you could macro out a spreadsheet or whatever as much as you wanted. There's still you're just dealing with a fundamental issue in the way businesses operate. So I'm wondering then, what sort of fundamental rethink should people do, should clients or firms think about, right, as approaching this, right? Instead of thinking, okay, this is how we've always done it, and this is comfortable, and this is how we're doing it. What are some ways that they might rethink just fundamentally their approach to the accruals process, or even just how they're billing?
Yes, I mean, one really powerful thing you can look at is value-based pricing, right? Accruals are acutely painful when it comes to hourly work, because law firms are having to do that estimate process. Clients are reliant on the law firm estimate as their guide. If you're looking at value-based pricing, a lot of those pains can disappear, right? It gets a lot clearer what costs the business is responsible for or has incurred when you've agreed to particular fee arrangements. There's obviously a little bit of margin in there for things like changes of scope or material deviations from work that you need to have a way of accounting for, but it simplifies a lot from that hourly billing process. A second thing that clients can do really effectively is be really clear with law firms about what the expectations are, what it is you're aiming for when it comes to those accruals. I think we often speak to law firms who are sometimes a little bit in the dark as to what clients are wanting to do with this data, right? And from a law firm's point of view, if they were trying to stick within a budget, or they're trying to give the client good news about a matter, they might be thinking very differently about that to the client who's actually wanting to know, as close to accurate as possible, what is the spend in this month going to turn out to be when we get invoiced, right? And again, a lot of the time, clients who run a manual accruals process, they then have to constantly true up that data. So as they get from the accrued data from the law firm, then they finally get invoiced, a month or two later on, they have to kind of do a reconciliation process with their finance team to account for some of the changes that can happen between work being performed and work actually being invoiced and paid.
So I think that's interesting because it touches on a subject that we talked about with our last guest, Maui Guevara, about just the communication between firms and clients and how there's a reluctance on either side to sort of communicate with one another sometimes because, clients don't want to feel like they're, having their over the shoulder of the firms, and the firms don't want to feel like they're not going to show the expertise here. But it sounds like what you're saying is also just communication can just play a role in this, in the way that clients and firms communicate with one another around this process and around the whole billing to sort of, eliminate some friction that might be there. You just talk a little bit more. That's all. Pick up the phone.
Exactly that. And I think they live in very different worlds, right? Like the brilliant lawyers that you're working with in your outside counsel firms, they're focused on delivering value for your matters. They're not accountants, and they're not necessarily like fully aware of some of the reporting requirements and obligations on the client side around how they report and track for this. And I think a lot of the time we speak with legal operations teams, we speak with the law firms they work with, and it becomes really clear that there is a bit of a mismatch in terms of expectations around accruals. Law firms aren't always aware of the kind of pain or friction that can cause for their clients internally, with finance. And I mean, this doesn't just manifest in the financial process of accruals. That's just a really acute way of seeing it. But actually, a lot of the fundamental disputes or disagreements that occur between clients and law firms aren't over the total value of the work or the value of the bill. They're over misalignment about what the client had as an expectation of that cost and then what has actually occurred. And both of those are kind of symptoms of a broader problem, which is misalignment around value. And yeah, I think, again, the more that clients and law firms can align around value earlier on in the process, the more problems that solves for. Accruals is one of them, but just more broadly, like how you're engaging firms and what your expectations are regarding cost and budget, you can solve for that much earlier in the process.
Let's talk about data for a second, because I know Apperio actually, you can generate a lot of data that helps inform these conversations. So let's talk about the role of data in improving the accruals process. Where is it, as you sit with Apperio, what's your approach to this? How are you tackling this?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting approach that you can take to accruals that's quite different to that estimate-based process that most clients are using now. What Apperio enables clients and law firms to do is to look at actual unbilled spend. So rather than law firms having to come up with an estimate for what the rest of the month would look like, in Apperio you could see, at the end of the month exactly what costs have been accrued, right? And by taking that estimation part of the process away, you simplify things dramatically for the law firm, right? They don't need to gather data from separate systems and then have some subjective input as to what they think that's going to be at the end of the month. You can use really factual data. And that has a nice added benefit for the client as well when it comes to the quality of the data you're providing to finance. It's much more robust, it's much more auditable. You can point to the source of data, as being from your law firm systems. You've got a very robust process for how you track what was initially accrued, what was then adjusted or written down, what was reduced at invoice level, and ultimately what was finally paid. And that process becomes much more transparent with better data. And the way Apperio facilitates that is actually helping the law firms to use their own internal system data to provide this type of reporting to clients in a way that's more efficient for the law firm, requires a lot less resource, and more accurate and much more reliable for the client.
Excellent. All right. So we've talked a lot about the processes today. We've taken a 10,000 foot view, but what's something that somebody watching this right now, what's one step that a client or firm could take right now to improve their accruals process and sort of make their lives a little bit easier?
I think the first thing to accept about your accruals process is that it's virtually impossible for it to be 100% accurate. The best thing you can do is set really clear expectations for your law firms about what it is you're trying to accomplish, what your finance team want to get out of the process, and then agree, what's most important. Accurate estimates based on where you are right now. Is it slightly better to have an over accrued amount so that you're not at risk of having higher cost than expected, and be really transparent on that with your law firms, and then get into a regular cadence of talking to them about the accruals and outcomes. Even if you do this in spreadsheet, it's quite straightforward to look at how accurate law firms' accrual submissions have been versus final payments. that's an important thing to pay attention to as a legal operations team, because if there are any outliers, that tells you that there's some misalignment there that you can then go and address. And the best way to do that is with conversation, being really clear about what the expectations are and really why this is a requirement for the legal operations team and the finance team.
Excellent. All right. Well, that was a deep dive into accruals. I can't imagine that there's been another podcast who has done such a lengthy exploration of the accruals process in the legal industry, but we're pioneers. What do you say? We're charting new territory here, and I couldn't do it without Chris Perry. He is the VP of Sales at Apperio, which is part of PERSUIT. We'll put a link to your LinkedIn in the show notes. Chris, thank you so much for being on the show today.
It's been a pleasure, Chris. Yeah, good talking to you.